All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be uncorking, so to speak, a subject near and dear to my heart. Italian sparkling wines. I'm particularly excited about this
I
one
can tell.
because I feel like, when people think Italian sparkling wines, immediately their brain goes to Prosecco, and that's not a bad thing. Prosecco is great. But there is a whole world, a wide world of Italian bubbly out there just waiting to be discovered.
Exactly, and it really speaks to the depth and diversity of Italian winemaking.
Right. And I know that there's this thing where sometimes you can get overwhelmed by a subject. Like there's just so much to know that you're just like, I don't even know where to start. And we're hoping that this deep dive gives you kind of the broad strokes. Like you get a good sense of what's out there, but we don't bog you down in like every single tiny detail.
Yeah.
But you walk away feeling like, okay, I've got a good grasp of this now.
Absolutely. It's all about providing that solid foundation, those key insights that really unlock the world of Italian sparkling wine for you.
Right, exactly. So, when we think about Italian sparkling wine, we think bubbles, obviously. That's the thing. But that history, it goes back further than you might think.
Oh, absolutely. When we talk about deliberately producing those bubbles,
Yeah.
that's obviously more recent. But there are these really interesting hints of naturally sparkling wines going all the way back to ancient Rome. Now, the Romans, they didn't quite understand why some wines had a slight fizz, but it definitely intrigued them.
Right, it's like this happy accident.
Exactly. And then, if we jump ahead to the Renaissance, we start seeing more intentional efforts, particularly in Piedmont.
Mm-hmm.
Producers were deliberately trying to capture that sparkle, often in sweeter styles, which makes sense given the palates of the time. Is like this early exploration, this curiosity about what made these wines so unique.
So it wasn't like this refined, champagne style method that we think of today. It was more like, oh, this wine's a little fizzy. Let's see what we can do with it.
Exactly. And it wasn't until the 19th century, with the rise of champagne, that things really started to shift.
Right. So Champagne, the French, they kind of figured out the whole second fermentation in the bottle thing. And the Italians were like, we can do that too, but Italian style.
That's a great way to put it. They saw the success, the prestige of champagne, and they were inspired to master that traditional method themselves, which is where we start to see the foundations of regions like Franciacorta.
Okay, so now we're talking like serious ambition and a real focus on creating those fine, persistent bubbles.
Exactly. And it's this evolution from those accidental bubbles to wines that are now competing on the world stage that makes this story so fascinating.
Right. And I think it's also important to emphasize that, Italian sparkling wine isn't a monolith. It's not just one style, one region.
Absolutely. It's this incredible tapestry of different regions, each with their own unique terroir and approach to sparkling wine production.
Okay, so let's paint that picture for our listeners.
Yeah.
When we talk about Italian sparkling wine regions, what are the key players that we absolutely need to know?
Well, you've got Franciacorta in Lombardy, a region that's fiercely dedicated to the Metodo Classico, but known for producing incredibly elegant sparkling wines.
Okay, that's one that always gets compared to champagne.
Exactly. And then you've got Trento DOC up in Trentino Alto Adige, another champion of the traditional method, but with this added dimension of high-altitude vineyards.
Mountain sparklers. I love that.
It is quite a dramatic setting. Then, of course, you've got Prosecco, primarily from Veneto and Friuli Venezia Giulia, the volume leader, and for good reason. It's approachable, it's delicious, and it's got that unique Charmat method that really sets it apart.
Okay, so we've got the big three, but there's more, right? It doesn't stop there.
Oh, not at all. There's Asti in Piedmont, known for its sweet, intensely aromatic sparklers made from Moscato Bianco.
Like little bursts of sunshine in a glass.
Exactly. And then there's Oltrepò Pavese, also in Lombardy, a bit of a hidden gem known for its Pinot Noir-based sparkling rosés and often made using the Metodo Classico.
Okay, so that's a lot to take in already, and I think this is where that sense of being overwhelmed can start to creep in. But it's important to remember that this diversity is what makes Italian sparkling wines so exciting.
Absolutely. And the exploration doesn't stop at the regions. There are also different production methods that really shape the character of these wines.
Right, the how is just as important as the where.
Exactly. You have the Metodo Classico, also known as Champenoise, which is that traditional method of second fermentation in the bottle. And then you have the Charmat method, also called the Italian method, which utilizes large, pressurized tanks for that second fermentation.
And that's the key difference between, say, a Franciacorta and a Prosecco, right?
Exactly. But it doesn't end there. You also have the unique Asti method for those aromatic Moscato-based wines. And then there are more artisanal approaches like the ancestral method, the transfer method, and even carbonation.
Okay, so the range of techniques is pretty impressive.
It is. And it really highlights the ingenuity and diversity of Italian winemaking.
And then you have the grapes themselves. It's not just Chardonnay and Pinot Noir.
Oh, no, not at all.
Yeah.
You have Glera, which is the star of Prosecco, and Moscato Bianco for Asti.
The aromatic powerhouses?
Absolutely. And then you have supporting players like Pinot Blanc, Pinot Meunier, and even Sangiovese showing up in sparkling rosés. And then there were these more obscure local heroes like Soprina, Dorella, and even, believe it or not, Nebbiolo and Barbera making appearances in sparkling wines.
That's wild. I didn't realize the range was that extensive.
It really is. And I think it's this combination of diverse regions, production methods, and grape varieties that allows Italian sparkling wines to really shine on the world stage.
Hmm.
You know, they're now rivaling some of those most prestigious champagne houses, which really speaks to the quality and the passion of Italian winemaking.
Okay, so we've set the stage. We've talked about the history, the regions, the greats, the methods. Now let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What actually defines an Italian sparkling wine, and more specifically, what makes it bubbly?
Okay, so at its core, what sets a sparkling wine apart from a still wine is that delightful presence of carbon dioxide, that CO2, that creates those tiny bubbles that dance on your tongue. And the CO2, it's the product of a second fermentation, whether it's happening in the bottle, like in Metodo Classico, or in a larger tank, like in the Charmat method.
Right, so it's that secondary fermentation that's really the key.
Exactly. But it's not just about the bubbles themselves. There's a whole symphony of elements at play. Acidity is vital. It's what gives those sparkling wines that refreshing, serializing, that vibrancy and that balance that's so crucial. And then, of course, you have the aromas, the flavors, which are really shaped by the grape varieties and the production method. And finally, there's the overall structure of the wine and that unique textural dimension that only those tiny bubbles can provide. It's a multisensory experience.
It is. It's like a party in your mouth.
It is.
Okay, and like with still wines, there's a classification system for Italian sparkling wines, right? Because when you're looking at a bottle, you want to be able to decipher what all those letters and acronyms actually mean.
Absolutely. And understanding this system can really elevate your appreciation. You'll often encounter designations like DOCG, which stands for Denominazione di Origine Controllata e Garantita. That's the highest tier of quality, reserved for wines from very specific areas that have, a long track record of excellence and very strict production regulations.
So if you see DOCG on the label, you know you're dealing with the creme de la creme.
Exactly. And in the world of sparkling wine, this includes prestigious names like Franciacorta, Asti, and some of those top-tier Prosecco areas, like Conegliano, Valdobbiadene, and Asolo. And then you have DOC, which is Denominazione di Origine Controllata. This covers a broader range of wines, still produced within specific geographical areas under controlled regulations, but with a little bit more flexibility. Prosecco DOC and Trento DOC are good examples.
Okay, so still high quality, but maybe not quite as strictly defined as DOCG.
Precisely. And then at the base level, you have IGT, which is Indicazione Geografica Tipica. This is the most flexible category. It allows for greater experimentation, maybe with different grape varieties or winemaking techniques. So, when you're looking at those bottles, think of DOCG as the gold standard, DOC is the silver, and IGT is a more experimental category.
Okay, that's helpful. Now let's zoom back in on those specific regions. We've talked about them in general terms, but let's really unpack what makes them unique. Franciacorta, the Pearl of Lombardy, it's the one that everyone always compares to champagne. What is it about Franciacorta that makes it so special, so prestigious?
Well, Franciacorta has truly earned that reputation. I mean, it's unwavering in its commitment to quality.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that really sets it apart, one of the key things, is that it exclusively uses the Metodo Classico. That's it. Only traditional method for Franciacorta.
Right, so that's that second fermentation happening in the bottle, the aging on the lees, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. And they use the same grape varieties that are celebrated in Champagne. Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Blanc.
Okay, so they're really going head-to-head with champagne in terms of grapes and method.
They are. And the resulting wines, they're known for their elegance, their complexity, and that really beautiful expression of yeast-derived aromas. Think brioche, think toasted bread, those really complex, nuanced notes that develop from that extended time aging on the lees. And they also have this incredible aging potential.
Right. So these are wines that can evolve beautifully in the cellar.
They can, and I think that's another thing that really elevates Franciacorta and puts it in that, that top tier of sparkling wine.
Okay, so Franciacorta, check. Now let's head northeast to Trentino Alto Adige, to Trento DOC, those mountain sparklers. What's the story there?
Oh, Trento DOC is fascinating. It's got this really compelling history, largely shaped by a man named Giulio Ferrari in the early 20th century.
Okay.
He was inspired by the quality and the tradition of Champagne, and he really envisioned Trento as a region capable of producing world-class sparkling wines.
So he was kind of a visionary, a pioneer.
Absolutely. And the region really embraced his vision. They were all about quality from the outset. And in 1993, Trento DOC became the first DOC in Italy dedicated solely to Metodo Classico production.
Wow, so they were really serious about making a statement.
They were. And of course, you can't talk about Trento DOC without talking about the dramatic landscape. It's nestled high in the Alps, and those mountains, they really influence everything about the wines.
Right, it's not just a pretty backdrop.
Exactly. So you've got this cool mountain climate, which is perfect for sparkling wine. You get these significant diurnal temperature variations, meaning there's a big difference between the daytime and nighttime temperatures.
Uh-huh.
And that's great for grape development. It allows those grapes to ripen slowly and develop complex aromas while retaining that really crisp acidity that's so crucial for sparkling wine.
Okay, so the mountains are working in their favor.
They are. And then you have the high-altitude vineyards. I mean, we're talking vineyards that are perched anywhere from 200 to 900 meters above sea level.
Wow, that's high.
It is. And that high altitude, it means the grapes get tons of sunshine, even though it's a cooler climate overall. And then the soils, they're primarily composed of limestone and dolomitic rock, which are known for imparting minerality and elegance to the wines.
So it's all about that interplay of climate and soil.
Exactly. And just like Franciacorta, Trento DOC embraces those classic Champagne grape varieties: Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and Pinot Blanc.
Okay, so another region really focused on that traditional method and those classic grapes.
Absolutely. And when you taste Trento DOC wines, you really taste that mountain influence. They're fresh, they're vibrant, they have this incredible minerality, and that really bright acidity just sings on the palate.
They sound delicious.
They are.
Okay, now for the big one, Prosecco. It's the most well-known, the most widely produced Italian sparkling wine. What is it about Prosecco that has captured the world's attention?
Well, Prosecco is all about approachability. It's about freshness. It's about those really vibrant, fruity aromas that just jump out of the glass.
Yeah.
And it's also incredibly versatile, both in terms of food pairing and just different occasions.
Right, you can dress it up or dress it down.
Exactly. It's a wine for every moment. Now, geographically, Prosecco primarily comes from the Veneto and Friuli Venezia Giulia regions, but within that area, there's a hierarchy of quality that's important to understand.
Okay, break that down for us.
At the top, you have Conegliano Valdobbiadene, DOCG, and a Solo Prosecco, DOCG. These are the areas known for producing the highest quality Prosecco, often with more complexity, more finesse, and more depth of flavor. And within Conegliano Valdobbiadene, you even have these subzones called Rive, which are specific vineyard sites that are known for their unique terroir. And then there's the Cartese subzone, which is considered the Grand Cru of Prosecco.
Wow, so there's a lot of nuance even within the DOCG level.
There is. And then you have the broader Prosecco DOC zone, which covers a much larger area and produces wines that are more approachable, more fruit-forward, and typically represent excellent value.
Okay, so DOCG is kind of like the top shelf, and DOC is like, your everyday go-to.
That's a good way to think about it. And of course, the grape that really defines Prosecco is Glera. It makes up at least 85% of the blend.
Glera, it's fun to say.
It is, and it's just as fun to drink. Glera is an aromatic grape, and it's got these really lovely, inviting aromas. Think crisp green apple, juicy pear, maybe some white peach or a touch of apricot, and then these really delicate floral notes like wisteria and acacia.
It sounds delicious.
It is. It's got this inherent freshness, this vibrancy that's just so appealing. And it's got good acidity, which makes it refreshing, but it's also got a relatively neutral flavor profile, which allows the terroir and the production method to shine through.
And that production, that's the Charmat method, right?
Yes. The Charmat method, also known as the Italian method, is really what sets Prosecco apart stylistically. It's all about preserving those fresh, fruity aromas and creating that lighter, more approachable style that we associate with Prosecco.
Right, so the second fermentation happens in these big tanks, these autoclaves, rather than in individual bottles like with the Metodo Classico.
Exactly. And that shorter fermentation time, that limited contact with the lees, it really ensures that those primary fruit aromas stay front and center.
It's all about that immediate burst of flavor.
It is, and that's one of the reasons why Prosecco is so popular. It's a wine that's meant to be enjoyed young, fresh, and vibrant.
Got it. Now, we've talked about brut and extra dry when it comes to Prosecco, but what do those terms actually mean in terms of sweetness?
Okay, so the sweetness levels in Prosecco can be a little confusing because the names don't always perfectly align with our perception of sweetness.
Right, extra dry sounds like it should be, well, extra dry.
Exactly. But it's actually a bit sweeter than brut.
Okay, so let's clear that up. What are the different sweetness levels you might encounter in Prosecco, and what do they actually mean for your taste buds?
Okay, so starting with the driest, you have brut nature. This has virtually no residual sugar, so it's incredibly dry, bone dry. Then you have extra brut, which is still very dry, but it might have a touch of sweetness, up to 6 grams of residual sugar per liter.
Okay.
Then comes brut, which is the most common style. It's considered dry, but it can have up to 12 grams of residual sugar.
Uh-huh.
So there's a little bit of perceptible sweetness there, but it's still quite dry overall. Then we get to extra dry, which is where it gets a bit counterintuitive. Despite the name, it's actually slightly sweeter than brut, with 12 to 17 grams of residual sugar.
Okay, so extra dry is actually less dry.
Exactly. Then comes dry, which is noticeably sweeter, with 17 to 32 grams of residual sugar. And then the sweetest style is demi-sec, which is quite sweet, with 32 to 50 grams of sugar.
Wow, so there's a whole spectrum of sweetness to explore.
There is, and understanding those sweetness levels can really help you choose a Prosecco that suits your palate and the occasion.
It can, and I think it's important to note that even though Prosecco is often associated with those fruity, sweeter styles, there are some really excellent dry Proseccos out there that are perfect for, those who prefer a more crisp, clean taste.
Absolutely. Don't be afraid to experiment.
All right, now let's move on to Asti DOCG, located in Piedmont. This is the land of those beautifully sweet and aromatic sparklers, the ones that really showcase the magic of the Moscato Bianco grape.
Asti is truly a special place. It's got this long and rich history of winemaking, and it's a region that's perfectly suited to producing those deliciously sweet and aromatic sparkling wines.
And the landscape there, it's pretty stunning, right?
It is. It's all rolling hills and vineyards. And those hills, they have these unique marl soils, which are great for drainage and for retaining heat, which is ideal for growing Moscato Bianco.
Okay, so the terroir is playing a big role here.
It is. And the climate, it's continental, which means you get warm summers and cool winters, which is also great for the grapes. It allows them to ripen slowly and develop those really intense aromas that we associate with Moscato.
And speaking of Moscato Bianco, that's the grape that really defines Asti, isn't it? What is it about this grape that makes it so special for sparkling wine?
Moscato Bianco is all about that intoxicating aroma, that unmistakable muscat character that just jumps out of the glass.
It's like a perfume.
It is. You get those heady notes of orange blossom, rose petals, ripe peach, juicy apricot, and this really distinct fresh grape aroma. And it's got this natural sweetness that's balanced by a bright acidity, so it's not cloying. It's really refreshing and delicious.
It sounds like a taste of summer.
It is. And the way they produce Asti, it's really unique, and it's all about preserving that natural sweetness and those delicate aromas.
Tell us about that production method.
It's called the Asti method, and it involves just a single fermentation, unlike most sparkling wines, which undergo a second fermentation. So they take the Moscato Bianco grapes, they press them, and then they ferment the juice in these large pressurized tanks called autoclaves. But the key is that they stop the fermentation before all the sugar is converted to alcohol.
How do they do that?
They chill the wine down to a very low temperature, which essentially puts the yeast to sleep and stops them from consuming any more sugar.
Ah, so it's like a controlled freeze.
Exactly. And that's how they retain that lovely sweetness and those delicate aromas. And the result is a naturally sweet, low-alcohol sparkling wine that's just bursting with those beautiful muscat flavors.
It sounds perfect for a warm afternoon.
He is. And there are two main styles of Asti that you'll encounter, Asti Spumante and Moscato d'Asti.
What's the difference?
The main difference is the level of sweetness and the intensity of the bubbles. Moscato d'Asti is a little sweeter with a lower alcohol content, usually around 4.5 to 6.5%. And it's what we call frizzante, which means it's lightly sparkling with a gentler fizz. Asti Spumante, on the other hand, is a little less sweet, with a slightly higher alcohol content, usually between 7 and 9%. And it's spumante, which means it's fully sparkling with more persistent bubbles.
So Moscato d'Asti is like the gentle, sweeter sibling, and Asti Spumante is a bit more lively.
That's a great way to put it, and both are absolutely delicious.
All right, now we've covered the big names in Italian sparkling wine, but as you mentioned earlier, there's a whole world of hidden gems out there waiting to be discovered.
There really is. And I think for anyone who really wants to delve deep into the world of Italian sparkling wine, exploring these lesser-known regions and producers is where it's at.
So let's take our listeners on a little adventure. What are some of the regions that we should be looking out for?
Okay, well, first, let's revisit Alto Adige up in the north. We talked about it briefly before, but it's really worth highlighting. Those alpine vineyards, they produce some incredibly crisp, mineral-driven sparkling wines that are just so refreshing. And then there's Sicily. It's becoming a real hotbed for innovative sparkling wine production. They're experimenting with indigenous grapes like Nerello Mascalese and Grillo, and they're producing wines that have this really unique Mediterranean character.
Okay, that sounds intriguing.
It is. And even Tuscany, which is best known for its red wines, is getting in on the sparkling wine game. They're producing some really interesting sparkling rosés from Sangiovese, and even a sparkling version of their famous Vinsanto dessert wine.
Wow, a sparkling dessert wine. That's interesting.
It is. And then you have regions like Oltrepò in Lombardy, which is producing some really excellent Metodo Classico wines from a variety of grapes, not just Pinot Noir. And then there's Lacini d'Arello in the Veneto, where they use the indigenous Durella grape to make these incredibly acidic, mineral-driven sparkling wines.
Okay, so lots of diversity in terms of grapes and styles.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about Lambrusco. It comes from Emilia-Romagna, and it covers a whole spectrum of styles, from dry and savory to sweet and fruity.
Lambrusco's having a bit of a moment right now, isn't it?
It is, and for good reason. There are some really excellent Lambruscos out there. And then for those who really want to go off the beaten path, you have regions like Abruzzo, where they produce Sarassuolo Spumante from the Montepulciano grape. And then there's Caluso in Piedmont, where they make these elegant sparkling wines from the Herbalusa grape. And the Marche region has Verdicchio Spumante, which is really crisp and refreshing. And Campania has sparkling wines made from Falanghina, which is an aromatic white grape. It's really endless.
It sounds like so many regions, so many grapes, so many styles to explore. It's amazing.
It is, and I think that's what's so exciting about Italian sparkling wine. There's something for everyone.
Okay, so we've talked about regions and grapes, but let's talk about those different production methods in a bit more detail. We know that Metodo Classico is the traditional method, the one that's used in champagne and in many of those prestigious Italian sparkling wines. But what exactly does it involve, and what makes it so special?
Okay, so the Metodo Classico is a multi-step process, and it's all about creating those fine, persistent bubbles and those complex yeasty aromas that we associate with high-quality sparkling wine. It starts with creating a still base wine, which is carefully selected for its high acidity and moderate alcohol.
So they're not just taking any old wine and adding bubbles to it. It starts with a very specific type of wine.
Exactly. And that base wine, it undergoes a second fermentation, but this fermentation happens in the bottle, not in a tank.
Okay, so this is where those individual bottles come into play.
Yes, so they take the base wine, they add a mixture of sugar and yeast called liqueur de tirage, and they bottle it. And then that bottle is sealed, and the yeast consumes the sugar, creating carbon dioxide, which are the bubbles, and alcohol.
So the magic happens right there in the bottle.
It does. And as that yeast consumes the sugar, it also dies and creates a sediment called lees.
Lees. Doesn't sound very glamorous.
It doesn't, but it's crucial for the flavor development. So the wine is then aged on those lees, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. And that contact with the lees, it gives the wine those complex, yeasty, toasty, nutty aromas that we love in a good sparkling wine.
Okay, so the lees are actually the good guys.
They are. And then comes the tricky part. They have to remove those lees from the bottle without losing all the bubbles.
Right, that's the challenge. How do they do that?
It's a process called riddling or remouage. They slowly and carefully turn and tilt the bottles over time so that the lees settle in the neck of the bottle.
It sounds like a very delicate process.
It is. And then comes degorgement, which is essentially freezing the neck of the bottle to trap those lees in a little ice plug. And then they pop the crown cap off, and the pressure in the bottle forces that ice plug out, taking the lees with it.
Oh, that's clever.
It is. And then the final step is dosage, where they add a little bit of sugar and wine back into the bottle to top it up and adjust the sweetness level. And then finally the cork goes in, and it's ready to be enjoyed.
So that's the Metodo Classico. It's a long process, it's labor-intensive, but the results are worth it.
Absolutely. It's a true testament to the artistry of winemaking.
Now, let's talk about the Charmat method, the one that's used for Prosecco. How does it differ from Metodo Classico, and what are the advantages?
Okay, so the Charmat method, it's all about efficiency and preserving those fresh, fruity aromas.
Okay.
So instead of the second fermentation happening in the bottle, it happens in a large pressurized tank, an autoclave.
So it's like a bulk process.
Exactly. And that means it's much faster and more cost-effective than Metodo Classico. And because the contact time with the lees is much shorter, the wines retain those bright, fresh, fruit-forward characteristics.
Right. It's all about that immediate appeal, that easy drinking style.
It is. And once that second fermentation is finished, the wine is filtered under pressure to remove the lees, and then it's bottled.
So it's a much more streamlined process.
It is. And that's why Prosecco can be so affordable and accessible. It's a great way to enjoy sparkling wine without breaking the bank.
Right. Now, you mentioned earlier that there are some other less common production methods used for Italian sparkling wine. Can you give us a quick rundown of those?
Sure. The ancestral method, also known as method ancestral or pétnat, is a really ancient technique where the wine is bottled before the first fermentation is finished. So the fermentation actually finishes in the bottle, creating the bubbles and the sediment.
Wow, so it's like capturing that wild, natural fermentation.
Exactly. And these wines, they tend to be a bit cloudy, a bit rustic, and they often have a little bit of residual sugar.
Okay, so it's a very different style.
It is. And then there's the transfer method, which is kind of a hybrid between Metodo Classico and Charmat. The second fermentation happens in the bottle, like in Metodo Classico, but then the wine is transferred to a tank under pressure, filtered, and then rebottled.
So they get the benefits of both methods.
In a way, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the Asti method, which we talked about earlier. That's the one that's unique to those sweet, aromatic Moscato wines.
Right, the single fermentation that's stopped by chilling the wine.
Exactly. And finally, there's carbonation, which is simply injecting CO2 into still wine.
Like making soda.
Yes, very similar. It's the simplest and least complex method, and it usually results in larger bubbles and a less nuanced flavor profile.
Okay, so a whole spectrum of methods, from the traditional to the modern.
Absolutely. And each method has its own advantages and disadvantages, and it really depends on the style of sparkling wine that the winemaker is trying to achieve.
Got it. So we've covered the basics of sparkling wine production. Now let's go back to those regional deep dives. We talked about Franciacorta and Trento DOC earlier, but let's revisit them with a bit more detail. What are some of the key things that wine lovers should know about these regions?
Well, Franciacorta, as we mentioned before, is really the crown jewel of Italian sparkling wine. It's known for its elegance, its complexity, and its aging potential. And the terroir there, it plays a huge role in the character of the wines.
What's the terroir like in Franciacorta?
Well, it's located in Lombardy, near Lake Iseo, and the soils there are primarily morenic, which means they're a mixture of clay, sand, gravel, and limestone. And that variety of soils, it provides excellent drainage, and it also contributes to that subtle minerality that you often find in Franciacorta wines.
Okay.
And the climate, it's temperate continental with warm summers and cool winters. And the proximity to the lake, it helps to moderate temperatures and create that ideal diurnal range, the difference between daytime and nighttime temperatures.
Right. That's important for grape development.
It is. And the permitted grape varieties in Franciacorta are Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Blanc, which are the same grapes that are used in Champagne.
Okay, so they're really sticking to that classic formula.
They are. And the resulting wines, they're just stunning. They're elegant, they're complex, they've got those beautiful yeast-derived aromas, and they can age beautifully.
And are there any specific styles of Franciacorta that we should be looking out for?
Yes, there are a few. One is Franciacorta Satin, which is a style that's made primarily with Chardonnay. And it undergoes a slightly lower pressure during the second fermentation, which gives it this incredibly creamy, soft texture. And the aromas are really delicate. Think white fruit, flowers, a little bit of toast. It's a beautiful aperitif style.
Sounds delicious.
It is. And then there's Franciacorta Rosé, which, as the name suggests, is a pink sparkling wine. It gets its color from the addition of Pinot Noir, either in the blend or through a method called saignée, where they bleed off some of the juice during fermentation.
Okay.
And